Come on down to Gormo's shed, come in and say g'day. We might run some trains or do some other stuff today. I don't know what we're gonna do, but we're gonna have some fun down in Gormo's shed. Down in Gormo's shed. G'day. G'day folks, and welcome to Gormo's Shed. Well, this week we've got something totally different again for you. What we're going to do is look at some basic hand tools and some of the things to look for with those tools. And this is especially aimed at those people who really, the younger folks I suppose, that are just starting out into model railways and building baseports and all that sort of thing. So this is just some tips about what to look for with some of your basic hand tools, and some little ways in which you can sort of improve how you use them, hopefully. So we'll do that now. Okay folks, here we are in Gormo's workshop. Now, the basics for doing any sort of woodwork really are the fundamentals. You need a saw, a hand saw. I mean, as time goes on, you may progress up to power saws and table saws and all that sort of thing, but usually we all start out with a hand saw. Now this is one that's got medium-sized teeth. You get the finer, the smaller the teeth you get, the finer the cut you get with the saw. And so I've had this thing now for at least 30 years. It's got tungsten carbide tips, and it's never been sharpened in its life, and still works as good as the day I bought it. Well, almost as good as the day I bought it. The other thing we need is a tape measure now, or a ruler of some description. But a tape measure, obviously, probably a lot of you have got all these things already, and a set square. Now there's all sorts of different types of set squares, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit of depth here, so we'll just have a look at that now. Now what I've done here is I've just put a bit of wood in the vise, and I'm going to show you how to check your set square. Right, what we've got here folks is we've got this sort of set square. It's got the edge on the back of it there. You lay it across, you can do lines and 45s and all that sort of thing. I've got one of those, I've got a couple of those actually, and I've got some of these. This one is an old one, made in Sheffield in England. This one from origin unknown, stainless steel, wacky do. And I'm pretty sure this one came out of a drill kit that I bought, and it's stainless steel again. Amazing. So that means they must be good. And this is my the one I actually use. This is an adjustable, a sliding set square, and it's made by Stanley. And this is a little ripper. So, and I'll show you why this one is good and the others aren't. Right folks, a simple method for checking to see if your set square is actually square. You lay the square across a piece of wood, hold it firmly, and draw a line nice and tight up against the sliding blade there. Now, if the set square is square, when you flip it over and then bring the blade up to the line again, it's absolutely dead flush with the line. That means the square is square. Now I've zoomed in folks, so you can actually see the line. You can see how the square comes up to the line there, spot on. Flip it over, bring it up to the line again, spot on. Now we'll do the same exercise with a good old Sheffield here. And I'll hold it firmly there, I'll draw the line, and obviously it's flush with that edge, but when I flip it over, hope you can see this, I'll bring it back up to there, and I hope you can see that, but there's a gap here. It's flush up there and there's a gap there. So this is useless if you're trying to do accurate work. And those other three main squares I showed you are exactly the same. This one, I think, I haven't used it for a long time, but I think it's actually better. I'll just draw a line there, and I'll just turn it around to check that one. That's actually pretty good, that one. So at least I know that's square as well. Right folks, if you're trying to do accurate work, you actually need to have a good set square. So you know, if you intend to go out and buy one, certainly go for the better brands. Go to a hardware store and get the best you can afford, and then when you get it home, check it, and if it's not true, take it back. It's as simple as that. Another useful thing to have in your arsenal of tools are these quick clamps. They come in various sizes and lengths and so on, but they're quite a versatile clamp. It's like having a third pair of hands. I mean, if you don't have a workbench, maybe you're working on an outside garden table, or even on the kitchen table or something, you can, or let's say your wife's good dining table, don't tell her that, but you can clamp the work to the table, and then it makes it much easier to actually do the cutting of the parts that you're working on. It's actually quite easy to use, and they're very quick. So if we put these two bits of wood together here, we release the clamp to slide it open, and I'll just put it sideways so you can see it. Put it under one part and squeeze the handle, and you'll see the parts coming, see the jaws coming together. When we get it down there close to where we want it, we just line it up properly, give it a squeeze as tight as you can, and she's right. And I mean, you could drill through that and do accurate drilling in both pieces. You could even clamp two pieces together to actually cut them, and you will know you've got exactly the same the length of the two pieces of timber if they're clamped together. So these are a very useful thing to have. Now folks, your tape measure. Now, they're a very handy little thing, aren't they? But what you've probably found, if you look closely at your tape measure, is that the end here, actually, I'll turn it around so you can see it, that moves. And the reason that moves is that so you can do inside measurements and outside measurements, and in theory you will get the same reading with both measurements. So if you were measuring the inside length of a box, for example, you could put this in one end of the box and push it up hard against the end, and then read what it says on the tape at the other end. However, if you had the box wall as a separate piece, if you laid that flat and then laid this over the end and pulled it that way, it should give you the same reading. Well, that's good in theory, but it's not necessarily the case. So to test our tape, folks, what we're going to do is we're going to hook it over one end there, and we'll mark off a length on here. To make it easy, we'll make sure that it's all pulled firmly there, and we'll make it exactly 400. Okay, now I'll use my set square to mark a line across there. Right. Now you can see there's 400 marked on there. Okay. Okay, now for the purposes of this demonstration, folks, I've just nailed a block of wood on the end there, so we can do the inside measurement now to test the theory, to test the tape measure to see how accurate it is. So this is what we're doing. We're putting the end of the tape up against the block of wood as though it was inside a box or whatever, or inside the frame for your baseboard, and we're taking the measurement again. Okay folks, now at first glance it looks pretty good, but when you actually look at it carefully, this tape's butted up to the end there. Now when you actually look at it carefully, it's actually closer to 401 there. So that's a problem. Now the tape measure side of things is not necessarily the end of the world. All it means is that you understand that you may have a discrepancy if you measure it one way or the other. So if you're building baseboard frames, for example, and you want to make sure that everything is absolutely spot on, well, do all your measurements using the one method. You know, stretch it over the end of the piece of timber and pull it out and then mark it that way. Don't sort of use a mixture of methods, because you'll get a variation in the measurement. Now, a millimetre might not sound like much, but over a number of different junctions and everything, it can cause quite a difference. And I mean, a baseboard frame doesn't have to be perfect. There's a lot of rough ones around, and mine are included in that. But when you aim for perfection, if you get pretty close to it, you're doing okay, and everything fits together much better. Now what we're going to do now, folks, is show you a method I use. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the right method, but it's the method I use for making quite a reasonable 90-degree cut on a piece of timber. So we use our square that we know now is true. I usually mark across the top as well as down the side, because this is my visual guide. Now I'll take my saw. Now I'll try and zoom in a bit on this. Okay, now we take our saw, and I use my finger firstly to guide it and make sure that it lines up on top of the line on the top, and it follows it so that it's at a right angle to the edge of the timber. Do a couple of light drags across the timber until it's made a line in the timber. Now, you don't have to force the saw, and what you want to do is long, even strokes. And bearing in mind you've got to watch the vertical plane of the saw, and at the same time make sure you're following the line. Let the saw do most of the work, having a light hold on it and doing those long straight cuts. As I say, let the saw do most of the work, and as it gets into the timber on either side becomes a guide for the saw. So just do nice, long, straight, even strokes, letting the saw find its way through the timber. Now as we get to the end, what you don't want is you don't want it to break off, because it'll actually splinter one of the pieces. So I'm holding it a bit awkwardly at the moment and just gently finding my way to the end there. I'm in an awkward position here, so that's my excuse and I'm sticking to it. Yes, what we do now that we can see it better, is we put the square across it, and you can see that that's a pretty good cut. And also if you put it that way, you can see that it's pretty square that way as well. So for a job done by hand, for a cut done by hand, that's fairly good. It just takes patience, and you can't be too aggressive with the saw. You've got to let the saw do its own work and use some of its own weight. I mean, you've got to help it along, but that's how you do it. Now, if you're not 100% confident with actually holding the saw vertical and getting it through the timber in an accurate way, even though the lines are drawn there are other ways to do it. There are things called mitre boxes. I generally don't use mitre boxes because I'm okay with doing it just by hand, but they are a good aid if you want to cut accurate 90-degree cuts and 45-degree cuts. They're very good. But there's also another method you can use which involves just using a piece of scrap timber. So I'll show you how to do that now. Right, first thing I'll do is mark out my line where I want to cut. So I'll just do it there, and we'll do the vertical as well, like that. And then I'll take my trusty clamp and a piece of scrap timber. Now to make sure I line this up properly, I will use my set square as a guide, and I will line the timber up. I'm sorry, you're on the wrong side there. I'll line the timber up with the line and making sure that it's absolutely dead true, and holding it in place there. I will put my clamp on, like so. Might even put that on a bit tighter there. Right, clamp is on. Now I'll have to move the camera so you can see what's going on. Okay, I've got my timber clamped in place, and I used the set square to set it up. It's clamped here, and it's lined up with the line that I want to cut, which is down there, that line in there. And you can see just going across the top there, the other line for the line across the timber. So now I bring the saw to the upright piece of timber I've got, and you've got to focus, and you've got to concentrate on keeping the saw blade flat against this piece of timber as you go down. So you've got to think of two things at once. You've got to, and I've actually got a bend in the saw blade. I don't know whether you can see that, but that's from holding it against that piece of timber. Now we just start our gentle cut again. Pushing gently, keeping the saw blade against the timber up here. And then holding the offcut. Go, and there it is, and there's the cut done with that one. That's very good actually. So that's another method you can use. I can see a slight amount of daylight, just no I can't, oh yes I can. There's a slight amount of daylight on this side, but it's so minor you wouldn't worry about it, but that's a really good cut in my opinion. So there you go. So that's another method you can use. A bit of cheating. There's no harm in that. The end result makes it all worth it. Well, there you go folks. That's just a couple of simple tips that you can use to make sure that you're getting accurate cuts on your timber if you're doing everything by hand. And I hope it stands you in good stead. I hope you've learnt something from that. There's a lot more things that we could go into, and as you progress with tools, everything gets more complicated as you get into power tools and so on. But we're trying to just stay with the basics and get a good result with some of the simpler tools that we use. So I hope you enjoyed that, and maybe we'll do an update and cover some other types of tools in the future. Okay, cheers, Gourmet. Come on down to Gourmet Shed, come in and say g'day. We might run some trains or do some other stuff today. I don't know what we're gonna do, but we're gonna have some fun.